The hum of fluorescent lights filled the cramped lab, their pale glow casting long shadows across the stainless steel counters. It was just after 7 p.m. on a winter night in 2003, and the building was quiet except for the steady click of a keyboard and the faint, mechanical whir of a DNA analyzer. In the far corner, Detective Marin Ortiz stood rigid, her breath fogging slightly in the cool, recycled air. She had been watching the progress bar creep toward completion for the last 20 minutes. Each blink of the machine's indicator light seemed louder than the last. When the screen finally flashed match confirmed, a tone sounded a short, flat beep, almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. But Ortiz's pulse quickened instantly. She stepped forward, leaning over the monitor. The data was there in black and white, a perfect profile match between the preserved biological evidence from a 1973 homicide and a recent entry in the National Codes database. 30 years of cold silence had just cracked open in a single clinical moment. She removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose. Her other hand, still gripping the thick manila case file, trembled almost imperceptibly. The file was worn, its edges soft from decades of handling, its cover stamped in faded red, unsolved. Inside were the photographs she had studied countless times, a young woman's lifeless body by the riverbank, the distinct ligature mark around her neck, the trace evidence collected and stored in paper envelopes that had sat in an evidence freezer for longer than Ortiz had been alive. The match hadn't come from a career criminal or a fugitive crossing state lines. Instead, the name attached to the profile was disturbingly ordinary, belonging to someone with no violent record. Just a recent arrest for a minor DUI in a different Wisconsin county, an incident so unremarkable that it might never have been noticed, had the arrest not triggered a routine DNA collection. Ortiz sat down slowly, the old wooden chair creaking under her. The lab smelled faintly of ethanol and something metallic, the lingering scent of process samples. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft flakes swirling in the orange light of the parking lot lamps. She barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the printout in her hand, scanning the name again and again, almost willing it to change. It didn't. There was a hollowness to her thoughts, the sensation investigators describe when the answer you've been chasing for years suddenly materializes, not with fanfare, but with a quiet, matter-of-fact cruelty. She thought of the original detectives who had worked this case, some long retired, some gone entirely. She wondered how many of them had privately suspected they would never see this day. Her fingers traced the cover of the case file, over the name of the first victim. She remembered the way the mother's voice had cracked when, years ago, she told Ortiz she just wanted to know if her daughter had been afraid. That was the kind of question Ortiz could never answer. Now, the question had shifted into something colder. How had this man lived, and moved, and smiled among them for 3 decades without suspicion falling on him again? She knew enough to understand that names on paper were never just names. Behind each one lay a history, a network of relationships, a footprint of places and people. And this name, this man, had crossed paths with at least one victim in a way that no one had ever documented. Not in any official report, not in any interview transcript. Yet Ortiz had stumbled on a vague mention in a peripheral witness statement weeks before, a throwaway line that suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. The thought tightened in her chest. The connection was there, hidden like a hairline fracture in an otherwise solid wall. She didn't yet know its full shape or its weight, only that it had been overlooked or buried, perhaps deliberately. The hum of the DNA analyzer resumed as the machine reset itself for the next case. Ortiz stood, slipping the printout into a protective sleeve, and shut the case file with a soft thud. She placed it back into her leather satchel, its weight heavier now, as though the decades of unanswered questions had just condensed into something tangible. Through the lab's narrow window, she could see the river in the distance, its surface a dark, glassy ribbon under the night sky. The same river where, all those years ago, the first victim had been found. The snow was falling harder now, blurring the outlines of the city beyond. Somewhere in that darkness, the man whose name she now knew was living an ordinary life, unaware, or perhaps all too aware, that the walls around him were about to close in. Ortiz whispered under her breath, not to the room, not to the machine, but to the memory of the case itself. 30 years, and it was him all along. What she didn't say out loud, what she barely allowed herself to think, was the part that disturbed her most, the truth that this man hadn't just appeared from nowhere. He had been here the whole time, woven into the same streets and the same routines as the people he'd hunted. And he had touched the life of at least one victim in a way no one had ever fully understood. The confirmation was a beginning and an ending at once, but it wasn't the whole story. Not yet, because somewhere in the fine print of the past, buried under decades of silence, was the reason why no one had connected him to her, and why he had been able to kill again. The night air in La Crosse on September 29, 1973, carried the sharp bite of early autumn, mixed with the sweet bitterness of beer drifting from the crowded beer gardens along Main Street. It was the height of Oktoberfest, and the town's core was alive with music, clinking glasses, and the low murmur of hundreds of conversations bleeding into one another. Street lamps cast pale cones of light over slick pavement, their reflections fractured by rainwater left behind from an afternoon shower. The smell of grilled bratwurst clung to the air, mingling with the faint tang of cigarette smoke. Linda Carver, 24 years old, stepped out from the doorway of a tavern just before 11 p.m. She had been with two friends since early evening, laughing over shared plates of pretzels and beer steins that sweated condensation onto the worn wooden tables. But her friends had decided to call it a night, one of them nursing an early shift the next morning. Linda, still awake and restless, insisted she could walk home. She lived less than a mile away, and the streets were busy enough to feel safe. Her last moments in public were recorded only in fragments. A bartender remembered her smile as she left, the faint swish of her dark coat brushing past the doorframe. A couple outside smoking recalled her walking briskly, head down, her long hair catching the yellow glow of the streetlight. The sound of music from the bar faded behind her, replaced by the rhythm of her heels striking the uneven sidewalk. At the corner of 4th and J Street, the crowd thinned. The festival noise receded into the distance, replaced by the quiet hum of a lone street lamp and the occasional rumble of a passing car. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, then stopped. A figure was seen standing in the shadow of a recessed doorway, still and watchful. Linda's pace slowed slightly as she adjusted her bag on her shoulder. She did not notice the figure step forward. A block away, a 14-year-old boy named Eric Lawson was riding his bicycle home from a friend's house. The tires hissed over damp asphalt, and the chain ticked as he coasted down the slight incline. From across the street, he saw Linda pause near the curb, speaking briefly to a man whose face was hidden beneath the brim of a cap. Eric's eyes followed as she stepped toward a dark-colored sedan parked at the edge of the road. The man opened the passenger door, and she got in. The car pulled away slowly, its tail lights shrinking to pinpricks of red before vanishing into the night. What happened after that was reconstructed only from what investigators could piece together in the weeks and months that followed. Sometime in the next hour, Linda was attacked. She fought back. Faint traces of skin under her fingernails would be found much later, but it was over quickly. The cause of death was manual strangulation, the bruises on her neck partially obscured by the deep ligature mark of a leather belt pulled tight. At 6:30 a.m. the next morning, the body was discovered by a jogger along a narrow trail that wound down to the Mississippi River. Mist clung to the surface of the water, blurring the line where river met sky. Linda lay on her side in the damp grass, her coat partially open, blouse torn at the shoulder. The earth beneath her was soft from the night's drizzle, the fabric of her skirt heavy with moisture. the smell of river mud mixed with the faint chemical scent of the plastic sheet that responding officers quickly spread over her. Detectives arrived within minutes, their shoes sinking slightly into the soft ground as they moved in a slow semicircle around the body. A small purse was found nearby, its contents scattered. Lipstick, a comb, 3 crumpled dollar bills. There was no sign of her shoes. A trail of flattened grass led up the embankment to a dirt service road, where faint tire impressions marked the mud. Eric Lawson's account was taken that same day. He described the sedan as dark blue or green, with a dent in the rear bumper. The man, he said, was tall, wearing a dark jacket and cap. He remembered the car door opening with a metallic creak and the muffled thud as it shut. Investigators wrote his statement in longhand on a yellow pad, adding it to the growing stack of reports in the case folder. In later years, Lawson would recall feeling dismissed during that interview. He was 14, and the detectives seemed in a hurry. He remembered one of them folding the page of notes in half, tucking it into the inside pocket of his jacket rather than into the main file. The boy's parents never heard from police again. The autopsy report concluded that Linda had likely been killed within an hour of leaving the tavern. Toxicology showed trace amounts of alcohol in her system, consistent with her evening out, but nothing that would have impaired her judgment enough to explain why she entered the car willingly. There was no sign of robbery. The assault had been controlled, deliberate, and without unnecessary violence, traits that, decades later, behavioral analysts would interpret as indicators of a practiced offender. The days that followed were thick with unease. Festival banners still fluttered above the streets, their bright colors at odds with the somber tone that settled over the community. Women began walking in pairs after dark. Conversations in grocery lines and church parking lots inevitably returned to the same questions. Who would do this? And were they still out there? But the detail that could have pointed investigators in the right direction, the 14-year-old sighting of a man leading Linda into a sedan, would soon fade from the official narrative. Weeks later, when journalists requested the case file, Lawson's statement was nowhere to be found. No one could say exactly when it had gone missing, or why. The boy's description of the car would not appear in any press release. This omission would remain unnoticed by the public, but it would matter. It would matter for years, quietly shaping the course of an investigation that seemed to stall almost before it began. And it would matter even more when, decades later, someone would finally ask why that page had vanished and who might have wanted it gone. The investigation began with a narrow focus. Within hours of identifying Linda Carver's body, detectives zeroed in on 2 men. The first was her former boyfriend, a factory worker she had broken up with 6 months earlier after a turbulent relationship. The second was a man who had been ejected from the tavern the night Linda was last seen, intoxicated and shouting at patrons on the sidewalk. Both men were questioned extensively, their names circulating in whispers through the community before any evidence was tested. The police station smelled faintly of coffee gone bitter from sitting on a hot plate too long. Files stacked unevenly on the desks, cigarette smoke drifting in thin layers near the ceiling. Each interview was conducted under the stark glare of fluorescent lights, the questions blunt, the tone impatient. The boyfriend denied seeing Linda that night. The tavern troublemaker insisted he had stumbled home alone. Polygraph tests were arranged, and when results came back inconclusive, suspicion lingered but proof was absent. Evidence from the scene, the belt used as the ligature, the clothing, the scattered belongings, was logged and stored. But with forensic science still in its infancy, much of it was handled with the casual confidence of the time. A single blonde hair clinging to the inside of Linda's coat collar was bagged, labeled, and then effectively forgotten. On the fabric near the neckline, under the harsh beam of a crime scene flashlight, there were faint flakes of skin, epithelial residue invisible to the naked eye, and in 1973, essentially useless. They were noted in passing, then sealed away. Public fear built quickly. Newspapers printed speculative headlines that skirted the line between information and rumor. Pressure from city officials mounted on the department to produce an arrest. At press conferences, detectives emphasized their progress, though in truth the investigation was narrowing prematurely. By February 1974, barely 6 months after Linda's death, the case was declared inactive. The decision was justified as a strategic shift of resources, but internally, officers admitted they had simply exhausted their chosen leads. Files were boxed and shelved, the chain of evidence sealed with brittle brown tape. The riverbank where Linda had been found returned to silence, the grass grown back over the flattened patch where her body once lay. What was not known publicly, and would not be revealed for decades, was that in the first week of the investigation, detectives had interviewed another man. He was cooperative, calm, and claimed to have seen nothing unusual that night. His name appeared briefly in the interview log, along with a notation that he had been working late at a warehouse across town, an alibi confirmed by a senior officer. That alibi was false. The officer who vouched for him was a respected figure in the department, someone whose word was rarely questioned. The verification was logged without cross-checking, and the man was quietly removed from the suspect pool. The notes from that interview, along with the corroborating statement, were later found to have been signed but undated, a subtle irregularity overlooked at the time. It was an omission that would shape everything that followed. The man, later identified in records as having no criminal record and a steady job, simply faded into the background. No one in the department raised the possibility that his connection to Linda might have been more than incidental. No one questioned why his name never reappeared in subsequent leads. Years later, a surviving detective would recall that first interview. He remembered the man's posture, straight-backed, hands folded neatly in his lap, voice level and unhurried. He remembered the faint smell of cologne, an expensive brand unusual for a laborer. At the time, the detective had been struck by the man's composure, the kind that either came from innocence or from an unshakable belief he could not be touched. When this detail surfaced decades later, it raised uncomfortable questions about what had really happened inside that small interview room in 1973. The notion that the killer had sat across from police, fielded their questions, and walked away under the shield of a false alibi was almost unbearable for those who had lived with the case. It suggested not just failure but complicity. The community never knew. They saw only the public narrative. 2 early suspects cleared for lack of evidence. The investigation stalled, resources redirected. Linda's name faded from the front page, her photograph appearing only in occasional anniversary articles about unsolved crimes. But in the evidence archive, amid the boxes stacked like forgotten monuments to unfinished work, a single manila envelope held something that had not been noticed at the time. Inside was a black and white photograph taken during the Oktoberfest celebrations, the night Linda disappeared. It showed a small group of revelers, mid-laugh, their faces lit by the glare of a streetlight. Linda was in the foreground, her smile frozen mid-turn towards someone just out of frame. Behind her, slightly blurred by motion, stood a tall man in a dark jacket, half his face caught in shadow. His gaze wasn't on the camera. It was fixed on her. The print bore no identifying marks, no name scrawled on the back, just the date, September 29, 1973, and the faint scent of aged paper when the envelope was opened. Whoever had taken it likely thought it was just another candid shot from a night of celebration, but for someone looking closely, it was something else entirely. The man in the background was the same man interviewed and cleared in the first week. And in that frozen moment, standing only a few feet away, he was close enough to reach out and touch her. In the year following Linda Carver's murder, Crosse tried to move forward. But in November 1974, almost exactly 14 months later, another body was found. Her name was Susan Darnell, a 22-year-old college student who had been out with friends at a downtown club. She never made it home. The next morning, her body was discovered in a wooded lot near the rail yard, partially hidden beneath fallen leaves. The cause of death was the same: manual strangulation with a secondary ligature mark from a belt. The scene carried the same signature: no signs of robbery, calculated use of force, clothing disturbed in a way that suggested both control and humiliation. By April 1975, it happened again. The third victim, Margaret Maggie Flannery, was 31, a waitress working the late shift at a bar near the riverfront. She was last seen locking up just before midnight on a Saturday. Her body was found the following afternoon, discarded behind an abandoned warehouse 2 miles from where she was last seen. The pattern was now undeniable: 3 women, all attacked late on a Saturday night, all strangled, all showing evidence of sexual assault. The newspapers gave him a name: the Saturday Night Strangler. The moniker stuck, and with it came an invisible line drawn across the lives of the women in Crosse. After dark, the streets emptied earlier. Bars saw fewer customers. Stores sold out of pepper spray within days of restocking. Women began walking in groups, scanning the reflections in storefront glass, noting the sound of every set of footsteps behind them. For Linda's family, the killings brought no sense of vindication, only the deepening of a wound that had never closed. Her mother refused to change a single thing in her daughter's bedroom. The curtains remained half-drawn, the bookshelf still lined with paperbacks and trinkets from high school. On the dresser, a framed photograph of Linda smiled out at no one. Her father coped in silence, until 10 years later, silence turned to something else entirely. In the spring of 1983, he took his own life. The note he left behind was brief, only a single line that read, "I can't live with what I don't know." The police worked each case as it came, but the threads between them were fragile and often frayed by the time they were compared. Evidence management was inconsistent. Photographs from one scene were misfiled with another. Witness statements were misplaced. And as the years passed, those who had been there moved on, their memories softening around the edges. False leads came and went. In 1976, a drifter was arrested in another county after telling a bar full of strangers that he was the Saturday Night Strangler. The confession crumbled within days. He knew none of the details that weren't already in the papers. In 1981, police arrested a local handyman after fibers found in his van were said to match one of the victim's clothing. Weeks later, independent testing revealed the fibers were synthetic and common in thousands of vehicles. His release deepened the growing divide in the community, some believing the police were protecting the real killer, others convinced they were simply incompetent. Time moved, but the case did not. The original detectives retired. The boxes of evidence were moved from one storage room to another. The crime scenes themselves faded, overgrown by weeds or repurposed into parking lots and new buildings. Only the families remembered every detail, every anniversary, every unanswered question. It was the third victim, Maggie Flannery, whose case would one day matter most. Among her belongings, recovered from her apartment in 1975, was a folded letter she had written to a close friend 2 weeks before her death. The handwriting was neat, the kind that came from habit, each loop and stroke deliberate. She wrote about her shifts at the bar, about a man she had noticed in the crowd more than once, always alone, always leaving just after she did. She ended with a line that would chill the friend who received it: "I think someone is watching me." At the time, the letter was seen as little more than a friend's private worry, not evidence of imminent danger. But decades later, when the letter was compared to other documents during a cold case review, something stood out. The handwriting bore a striking resemblance to a note archived from a completely different context: a congratulatory letter sent to a local charity by a donor who had remained active in the community for years. The charity records did not seem relevant to the murders, at least not on their face. But in the letter to the charity, the signature carried a name that investigators in 1973 had once written down: questioned and dismissed. The connection was not made then. It would not be made for almost 30 years. By the early 1980s, the Saturday Night Strangler seemed to have vanished. No new cases emerged with the same signature. Some believed he had been arrested for another crime. Others thought he had moved away or died. But for those who had lived through those years, the absence was not a comfort. It was a reminder that he had once walked among them and might still be doing so. The city learned to speak of him in the past tense, but the tension never truly left. Even in daylight, certain corners of the riverfront carried an unspoken weight. Women still locked their doors earlier than they once did. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. The killer's name was never known, but his shadow stretched over decades, shaping how people moved, how they trusted, and how they looked at strangers. And somewhere, tucked away in the dusty files of an unremarkable local charity, was the same handwriting that had once warned, "I think someone is watching me." It would take years before anyone would understand just how literal that sentence had been. By 2002, the three murders from the mid-1970s existed in the department's memory as little more than fading case numbers on a dusty shelf. Wisconsin's new statewide initiative to re-examine unsolved violent crimes through DNA testing seemed at first like a bureaucratic footnote. But to Detective Marin Ortiz, it was a door that had been bolted shut for 30 years, now cracked open by technology that hadn't existed when the first body was found by the river. She began with the simplest question: what if anything had survived the years? The answer lay in a climate-controlled evidence room, the air cool and dry, smelling faintly of cardboard and desiccant. She traced the faded handwriting on the masking tape that sealed the boxes: Carver, 1973, Darnell, 1974, Flannery, 1975. The seals had not been broken in decades. Inside, paper envelopes, some yellowed with age, contained fibers, hairs, and the scrapings from beneath the victim's nails. The belt from the first case, still tagged, bore the faint imprint of its original evidence label. Ortiz knew that time degraded everything: memory, witness accounts, even biological traces. But DNA could endure in ways that defied expectation. Each item was repackaged under sterile conditions and sent to the state crime lab. The weeks that followed were filled with waiting, the silence broken only by the daily rhythm of other cases. Then, late one evening, Ortiz returned to her desk to find 3 separate lab reports clipped together. The results were unambiguous. The same DNA profile had been identified in all 3 murders. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the national database, its anonymous string of genetic markers awaiting a match. Ortiz imagined the profile like a fingerprint hovering in a digital void, waiting for its twin to appear. When the hit came, it was almost anticlimactic. An alert on her screen, the name typed in neutral font as though it carried no weight. Robert Hale, age 62, arrested the previous year in another county for driving under the influence. No prior convictions for violent crimes. The DUI arrest had triggered a mandatory DNA collection under state law. That single, minor charge had been enough to surface him from the dark water of anonymity. Hale's history was deceptively ordinary. He had worked for decades as a delivery driver, his routes covering the neighborhoods, bars, and festival areas that matched the victim's last known locations. Ortiz built a timeline, plotting his delivery schedules against the dates of the murders. The overlaps were too precise to ignore. On each Saturday night a victim vanished. Hale had finished his route within a short walk or drive from where she was last seen. There was more. In the course of digging through archival material, Ortiz came across a name in a different context. Robert Hale listed as an active member of a small local charity during the 1970s. Both Susan Darnell and Maggie Flannery had volunteered at events for that same charity. At the time, no one had considered the overlap significant. Now, it felt like a thread waiting to be pulled. She tracked down old rosters, scanned photographs from fundraising events. In one taken at a summer picnic, Hale stood at the edge of the group, his posture relaxed, a faint smile on his face. Behind him, one of the victims laughed with other volunteers, unaware of the man in the background. Ortiz read through decades of financial records, donor acknowledgments, and meeting minutes. In a file marked 1973, she found a handwritten note thanking the charity for its work, signed in the same neat script as the letter Maggie had written to her friend before her death. The content was different, but the loops and slants of the pen told their own story. The deeper Ortiz went, the more the past began to fold in on itself. She pulled Hale's original interview transcript from 1973 and saw again the notation that his alibi had been confirmed by a senior officer. It was a brief, confident statement, free of hesitation. But in the margins of a separate file, she found something else. A photocopy of an old booking record from that same week, showing Hale's name for a minor trespassing incident. The charge had been dropped within hours, replaced by a note that he had been released to responsible party. That responsible party was the same officer who had vouched for his alibi in the Carver case. The revelation hit with the slow, cold weight of inevitability. The connection between the suspect and the man running the investigation wasn't supposed to exist, but there it was, preserved in the impersonal ink of official paperwork. The implications were corrosive. Had the officer known what Hale had done? Or had he been blinded by friendship, by loyalty, by something darker? Ortiz closed the file slowly, her fingers pressing into the worn cardboard. The hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, the air heavier. She thought about the families who had lived decades without answers, about the photographs of young women taken before their names became case numbers. Somewhere out there, Robert Hale had lived an unremarkable life, the kind that never drew attention. And somewhere in the same town, the man who had helped him slip away still walked the streets, his role buried in a history that was only now being unearthed. The chain between them had been invisible for 30 years. Now Ortiz could see it clearly. What she didn't yet know was just how far back it stretched, and how many others might have been standing in the shadows when the first link was forged. Robert Hale's name carried a kind of unshakable normalcy. In the quiet neighborhoods of Crosse, he was the man who waved at passing cars, shoveled snow from the sidewalk in front of his neighbor's house, and sat on the same worn pew every Sunday. In 1989, the local paper photographed him holding a plaque for Citizen of the Year, a broad grin under neatly combed hair. The caption spoke of his dedication to community service and decades of volunteer work. His house sat just 6 blocks from the spot where Linda Carver's body had been found in 1973. Detective Marin Ortiz studied those images with the detachment of someone piecing together a puzzle whose corners didn't yet align. In the photographs, Hale was often just outside the center of focus, standing at the edge of a group, hands in pockets, smiling faintly. But the more she looked, the more the pattern revealed itself. He was there at the Oktoberfest parade in 1973, visible in the background of another candid shot from the crowd. He appeared again in a 1974 charity picnic photograph, and once more in a 1975 street fair picture taken the day before Maggie Flannery disappeared. Always peripheral, always watching. While combing through archived clippings, Ortiz found a piece from late 1973 that froze her in place. It was a human interest story about the Carver family after Linda's death, focusing on her grieving mother. A grainy black and white photograph showed her seated at her kitchen table, a wrapped gift resting in front of her. The caption explained that a friend of the family had given it as a token of sympathy. The article didn't name the friend, but the photograph did. Hale sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on the gift box. Ortiz requested access to the evidence inventory from 1973. In it, she found something strange, a silver keychain with a small enamel charm, described as missing from Linda's personal effects. That keychain matched the charm dangling from the bow on the gift box in the photograph. It was subtle, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but to Ortiz it was unmistakable. Hale had taken something from the crime scene and weeks later returned it to the victim's mother disguised as a gesture of condolence. That act, Ortiz realized, was not only taunting but deeply calculated. In the mind of someone like Hale, it was a way of maintaining control over the narrative, inserting himself into the grief he had created. He wasn't simply hiding in plain sight. He was weaving himself into the story, confident no one would question his presence. With the DNA match in hand, Ortiz needed confirmation that could withstand the scrutiny of a trial. Surveillance was impractical. Hale lived quietly, left little trace, and had no reason to discard anything that could provide a fresh sample. So she decided to create an opportunity, an upcoming anniversary gala for the local charity. The same organization linking two of the victims would draw many former volunteers and members. Ortiz arranged for Hale to receive a formal invitation, citing his years of service. She attended herself, blending into the crowd in a simple dark dress, watching the entrances as guests arrived. The event was held in a community hall with high ceilings and the faint scent of polished wood. Round tables filled the room, each topped with white linens and flickering tea lights. Ortiz saw Hale enter just before 7 p.m., wearing a charcoal suit and carrying himself with the easy composure of someone accustomed to public recognition. He shook hands, smiled for photographs, and accepted compliments from people who had known him for decades. She waited until he was seated at a table with other longtime members. A server brought drinks, and Ortiz watched as Hale lifted a glass of water to his lips. When he set it down, she gave a subtle nod to the evidence technician disguised as catering staff. The glass would later be collected from the tray, sealed, and sent to the lab. But even as she executed the plan, Ortiz felt his attention shift toward her. Across the room, Hale's gaze fixed on her with an intensity that cut through the hum of conversation. He didn't look away. His expression was not confusion or curiosity, it was recognition. The corners of his mouth turned upward in a slow, deliberate smile. The moment stretched longer than it should have. In that smile, Ortiz sensed something chilling, not the panic of a man who knew he'd been caught, but the acknowledgement of a game he believed he was still playing. He tilted his head slightly, as if to say he understood exactly why she was there, and that the chase had only just begun. She turned away first, breaking the connection, but the weight of that look followed her long after the gala ended. The glass, carefully handled and transported, would yield exactly what she expected. A perfect match to the DNA from all three murders. What she didn't yet know was how deep Hale's history ran, and how many other photographs, other faces, might appear if she kept pulling at the threads of his life. The charity events, the public accolades, the neighborly gestures, all of it might have been part of a facade that had been in place for decades. And somewhere in that facade, Ortiz suspected, there were more moments like the gift to Linda's mother, acts of intrusion disguised as kindness, each one leaving a mark no one had recognized at the time. She now had the proof she needed to bring him in. But she also understood that for 30 years, Hale had moved through this town believing no one would ever look close enough to see him for what he was. As she left the hall that night, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind her, Ortiz felt the temperature of the air outside hit her like a sudden drop in altitude. The street was quiet, the glow from the windows spilling onto the pavement. Somewhere inside, Hale was still at his table, his smile lingering in her mind like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. She knew the next time they met, it wouldn't be across a crowded room. It would be in a place where there was nowhere left for him to stand at the edges, nowhere to hide behind the anonymity he had worn so well. But in that last look he had given her, she thought she saw something else, a hint that he might already be planning what to say when that moment came. The interrogation room was small, the air heavy with the faint odor of disinfectant and old paint. Robert Hale sat across from Detective Marin Ortiz, his hands resting loosely on the metal table, fingers interlaced. His posture was almost casual, but his eyes followed every movement she made. The evidence folder lay between them, a silent weight neither had yet touched. Ortiz began by stating the facts, her tone measured and precise. The DNA from the 3 murders, preserved for decades, matched the sample collected from his glass at the charity gala. She described each case without embellishment: the location, the ligature marks, the fibers, the consistent pattern of control and disposal. Hale listened without interruption, his face impassive, until she slid the lab report toward him. He glanced down, read a few lines, and then leaned back in his chair. At first, his expression was one of mild offense, as if the accusation were beneath him, but slowly, a thin smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He exhaled through his nose, a sound that was not quite a laugh, and then looked directly at her. "You've been chasing the wrong people for 30 years, he said, his voice low and steady. "Until now." The shift was almost imperceptible, but Ortiz felt it. He was no longer defending himself. He was settling into the role of storyteller. He described choosing Saturday nights with the same detachment someone might use to explain a business decision. "The streets were alive," he said. "Music in the bars, people talking, laughing. Nobody hears a cry for help when there's a brass band playing half a block away." He spoke of the approach, waiting until they were between pools of light, until the noise of the festival faded just enough to isolate them without breaking the illusion of safety. He favored strangulation because, in his words, it's not messy, and you see them understand, you see the moment they know. His voice didn't falter, and there was no sign of remorse. If anything, he seemed to take pride in the control, in the precision with which he described their final moments. When Ortiz pressed him about the gap after 1975, his answer came without hesitation. "You stop when the risk changes. You stop when there's heat, but you never forget the ones you didn't finish." It was then that he leaned forward, his voice dropping. He told her about a night in late 1976 when he had followed a woman from a church event to her home. She had been alone, carrying a paper bag of groceries. He had waited until she unlocked her front door, intending to push inside, but the sudden sweep of headlights washed over the driveway. A police cruiser rolled past, slow but deliberate, the officer's eyes meeting his. Hale had turned and walked away, the moment lost. Ortiz asked for her name. He gave it without pause. The woman was now 70 years old, still living in La Crosse, her life untouched by the knowledge that it had once been measured in seconds. Hale spoke of her not with regret, but with the curiosity of someone describing an unfinished project. "I sometimes wondered if she ever felt it," he said. "That pull, that sense that something was just a step behind her." Ortiz didn't respond. She was thinking of the ripple effect, how a single moment of chance, a patrol car passing at the right time, had drawn the line between life and death without the intended victim ever knowing. The rest of his account was clinical. He did not embellish or attempt to justify his actions. He framed them as inevitabilities, the product of opportunity meeting desire. He claimed he had not stalked the victims for long periods, but selected them in the moment, relying on instinct to read vulnerability. There was one more detail, subtle but telling. He mentioned keeping small items, a ribbon, a cigarette lighter, a coin, not for the thrill of possession, but to remind himself of how easy it was. He said it as if the act of killing were secondary to the proof that he could. Ortiz closed the folder without looking down. The weight of the confession was not in the words themselves, but in the absence of anything resembling humanity in his delivery. He was not reliving trauma. He was recounting a series of completed tasks. Outside the room, the hallway smelled faintly of brewed coffee and copper toner. Officers moved quietly, their voices low, as if the sound could disturb the balance inside. Ortiz stepped out for a moment, letting the cool air of the corridor steady her. Somewhere in the city, a 70-year-old woman was going about her day, unaware that the man in the next room had once chosen her as a target. And for the first time since the match appeared on her screen, Ortiz wondered how many others might still be living their lives under the shadow of a moment they never saw, moments that Hale had carried with him like unmarked trophies. The trial of Robert Hale drew a kind of muted attention, the kind reserved for crimes so old that the city had learned to live alongside them. In the courtroom, the air was stale, heavy with the mix of paper, wood polish, and too many bodies in too small a space. Family members of the victims sat in the front rows, their faces lined not only by grief, but by decades of waiting. The DNA evidence was presented methodically, the timeline reconstructed with clinical precision. Hale showed little reaction, his hands folded neatly on the defense table, eyes occasionally scanning the gallery as if looking for a familiar face. When the guilty verdict was read, there was no outburst, no visible release of tension. Linda Carver's mother gripped the edge of the bench in front of her knuckles whitening, her expression unreadable. Outside the courthouse, microphones were thrust forward, but her only comment was a quiet, "We have answers now, that's all." It was the truth, but not the whole truth. The answers did not bring Linda back. They did not erase 30 years of absence. For Susan Darnell's sister, the conviction felt like the closing of a wound that had never healed, but the scar remained. Maggie Flannery's brother spoke of the relief in knowing the right man had been caught, followed by the realization that Hale had lived just a few streets away for most of their adult lives. The proximity was a new wound in itself. The case reverberated beyond the families. In Madison, legislators cited it as a catalyst for expanding funding toward the testing of cold case evidence statewide. The Hale conviction became a model in law enforcement training seminars, illustrating how preserved evidence could outlast the careers of the original investigators. The state crime lab received new resources, and a backlog of unsolved cases began moving, slowly but steadily, toward resolution. But there was another legacy, one less visible in policy and more present in the undercurrent of the city's daily life. The surviving intended victim, the woman Hale had followed in 1976, was told for the first time that she had been within moments of becoming his fourth murder. At 70, she received the information with a quiet disbelief, the kind that left her staring at a wall for long minutes after the detectives left her home. She had lived her life without knowing that a single sweep of headlights had shifted her fate. For Ortiz, the close of the case brought no celebration. She returned to the evidence room one last time, pulling the original Carver file from the shelf. The paper was brittle now, the black ink faded to a dull gray. She traced her finger over the first crime scene photograph, the blurred background where Hale had once stood in the crowd, almost invisible. It was the image she could not shake, not the violence itself, but the fact that for all these years he had been hiding in plain sight. On an overcast afternoon, she drove to the riverbank where Linda's body had been found in 1973. The grass was high now, dotted with yellow wildflowers, the smell of damp earth rising in the cool breeze. The water moved slowly, its surface dark and reflective. She stood for a long time without speaking, listening to the faint rush of the current and the distant hum of traffic. She thought about the chain of events, the missing witness statement, the false alibi, the officer who had vouched for him, the decades of silence. None of it had been inevitable, but all of it had been allowed. Hale had lived among them, his life uninterrupted, his crimes undetected, his face present in photographs that no one had looked at closely enough. When she finally spoke, it was to no one in particular, her voice nearly carried away by the wind. He was always here, right under our noses. The river kept moving, indifferent to the history it had witnessed. And in the fading light, Ortiz turned away, the sound of the water following her back up the path, leaving the place as she had found it, quiet, ordinary, and unchanged, except for the knowledge of what had once been there.